Why don't you explain it to them, Mira? Adrian's voice slid through the microphone like a blade wrapped in velvet. The laughter that followed wasn't loud, just sharp enough to sting. Glasses chimed. Shoes scraped nervously on the old, uneven deck. The drowned ship groaned beneath us, a hollow, rusted beast half swallowed by the sea, resurrected tonight only for this corporate spectacle. I stood in the cone of yellow stage light, its warmth doing nothing for the chill crawling up my spine. My fingers tightened around a glass of champagne that had long since gone flat. Every face in that room turned toward me, curious, entertained, expectant. A performance. My humiliation as after-dinner theater. The projections behind you, Mira, Adrian added with an indulgent smile. In case the numbers slipped your mind again, a woman near the bar exhaled quickly, the kind of almost laugh people make when they want to hide the fact that they enjoy the cruelty. Behind me, the oversized screens glowed with descending bars and red circles. My department, my work, framed as failure. Even the ocean outside the panoramic windows seemed to watch, its black surface reflecting the graphs like a quiet accusation. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to see it. I'd seen it all before. Adrian's footsteps clicked closer, his confidence almost theatrical. He thrived on moments like this, orchestrated, public, controlled. You've been very optimistic lately, he said. Perhaps tonight is a good time to be realistic. More laughter, more eyes. I finally met his gaze. His suit was immaculate, his expression curated. To everyone else, he looked like a leader in command of his kingdom. But standing this close, I could see the small, unguarded flicker of triumph. He believed he'd cornered me. He believed this was the moment I broke. I inhaled slowly, letting the salt-touched air steady me. I am being realistic, I said quietly. I'm simply not measuring what you are. A hush rippled through the crowd, thin but sharp, like the air before a storm breaks. They thought this was the moment I fell apart. They had no idea it was the moment I began. And before this ship sank back into the dark, they would finally learn whose numbers truly mattered. A single spotlight hummed above me, flickering just enough to make the moment feel unstable. But I wasn't the one trembling. The room was. The people. Their certainty. Adrian lowered the microphone a fraction, just enough to study my face. He expected embarrassment, a flush, a stammer, some small collapse he could pretend to regret later. Instead, I took a slow step forward. The ship's deck answered with a low groan, its old bones shifting beneath layers of polish the company had thrown over it for this grand celebration. It wasn't lost on me how often they covered decay with decoration. How interesting, Adrian said, tone bright but eyes narrowing. You sound confident. I didn't respond. Not yet. Silence is a truth serum even for the powerful. And I watched him drink it. People leaned closer, eager, unsettled. The senior board members sat rigid at their designated table, their reflections rippling on the dark glass behind them as the sea drew lazy shapes around the ship's hull. If anyone looked closely, they might have noticed that my hands weren't shaking, that my breath was even, that, despite the humiliation staged for me, something about my stillness felt wrong to them, or right to me. You're welcome to explain, Adrian pressed. We're all listening, he said it lightly. But there was something beneath it, a thread of frustration. A thread only someone who knew him too well would catch. I tilted my head, observing him the way one might consider a painting they've seen 1,000 times yet only now understand what's missing. Not all numbers belong on screens, Adrian, I said softly. Some you only feel when they shift. A few people exchanged glances, the confused kind, the uneasy kind. The ship creaked louder, as if agreeing. He laughed, but it wasn't his real one. The real one came from deep in his chest and always followed cruelty. This one was thinner, stretched. Mira, he said, stepping closer. You're deflecting, or clarifying. He opened his mouth again, but something in my expression made him hesitate. A flicker of doubt, a momentary disconnect in the script he'd rehearsed. And that was when I realized the room was no longer laughing. They were watching, really watching, because they sensed something, not knowledge, not context, but a quiet shift in gravity they didn't yet understand. And Adrian felt it too. He just didn't know the tide had already turned. What he said next would expose more than he ever intended, and it would be the first crack in his perfect facade. You said. Part 3 Stories said. Part 3 The first crack in the glass. Adrian straightened his shoulders, the way he always did when he felt attention slipping from his grasp. He wasn't used to losing a room, not to anyone, and certainly not to me. Well, he began, lifting the microphone again, if you won't explain your numbers, Mira, perhaps I should explain them for you. There it was, the performative benevolence, the velvet-wrapped blade. He gestured toward the screens, inviting the audience to take in the plunging graphs, the red arrows, the curated narrative of my failure. But something strange happened. The room did look, yet not with the smug amusement he expected. Their eyes flicked from the screens to me, to him, as if trying to reconcile something that suddenly didn't align. Adrian noticed the shift a second too late. He cleared his throat, trying again. These projections are incomplete, I said calmly. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They cut through the murmurs like a slow, deliberate knife. For the first time all evening, Adrian's smile faltered. A hairline fracture, barely visible but unmistakable. Incomplete? He repeated. Mira, the data came from your team, and the narrative came from you, I replied. Several people stiffened, subtle, but enough. Even the sea outside seemed to press closer to the glass, listening. He gave a small, dismissive shake of his head. Let's not be dramatic. I'm not, I said. I'm being precise. The ship let out a groaning shudder, metal complaining under the strain of the tide. A few guests glanced at the floor uneasily, as if the vessel itself disapproved of the direction this conversation was taking. I stepped closer to him, closing the gap he thought he controlled. My voice stayed low, private in tone even though everyone heard it. You cherry-picked the quarter after the restructuring. You left out the recovery curve. And you didn't show the projections adjusted for the new partnership. A ripple cut through the room. Recognition, confusion, unease. Adrian blinked. Once, twice, too slow. His polished narrative was slipping. He hadn't expected resistance. He certainly hadn't expected accuracy. Mira, he said tightly, we can discuss internal strategy in the proper setting. Then why did you bring it here? I asked softly, if not to make a spectacle of it. The microphone lowered by an inch. His jaw tightened by a fraction. And there it was, the second crack. Because now the crowd wasn't watching me. They were watching him, searching for confidence that wasn't fully there, listening for authority that suddenly sounded rehearsed. A ship may look solid from above, but all it takes is the right pressure to reveal where the water is already seeping in. And Adrian, for the first time in years, was beginning to feel the cold. What happened next would turn unease into suspicion, and suspicion into something far harder for him to control. A soft, uneasy silence unfurled across the deck, not empty, but charged. The kind of silence that gathers when people realize they might have chosen the wrong side too quickly. I watched them shift in their seats, watched the confidence drain from the eyes that had laughed at me minutes earlier. The drowned ship tilted slightly as a wave rolled beneath it, and the lights above us swayed in a slow arc, casting moving shadows across their uncertain faces. Adrian noticed. Of course he did. He was a man who lived off the temperature of a room. And right now, the temperature had dropped a degree. He tightened his grip on the microphone, softening his tone as if he could coax the moment back into his control. Everyone here knows Mira is passionate about her work, he said carefully, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Sometimes a bit too close to it. That's why what? I asked gently. I wanted him to finish the sentence, to walk himself into the truth without my help. He hesitated. A small pause, but in a room full of executives, even a single heartbeat of hesitation was louder than an alarm bell. Finally, he continued, that's why I thought it best to give the broader context myself. I didn't want the team to be misled. The words landed with a soft thud, not triumphant, Not convincing. Just wrong. Someone near the bar shifted and whispered to a colleague. Someone else folded their arms. The room was no longer performing admiration for him. It was calculating. I held his gaze, unwavering. So you removed half the data because you thought people would be misled by the truth? A subtle gasp. A few widened eyes. Adrian's jaw flexed the smallest tick, but devastating in what it revealed. He opened his mouth to respond, but I continued before he could reclaim the air. Transparency isn't optional in a company built on trust. Accuracy isn't either. I stepped closer, my voice steady, almost gentle. Unless, of course, trust isn't what you were aiming for tonight. The ship shifted again, a long, low groan that made the hanging lantern sway. Shadows danced across the ceiling like something alive. Someone at the board table leaned forward, elbows on knees, watching Adrian with the sharp interest of a man suddenly realizing he may have misjudged the evening's hierarchy. Adrian felt the shift. His posture tightened. His smile thinned to a razor's edge. "Careful, Mira," he said quietly, the microphone lowering even further. "You're bordering on insubordination." "No," I said. "Just clarity." He blinked slowly as if weighing a response he couldn't quite assemble in time. Because this wasn't going the way he planned. Because people were listening now, truly listening. Because a narrative he'd shaped for months was slipping through his fingers, grain by grain. And somewhere deep beneath us, the drowned ship moaned again, old water stirring in its hollow belly. As if even the sea could sense the shift in power. But the moment that followed, the one he never saw coming, would be the one that made the entire room question everything they thought they knew. It happened so quickly most people almost missed it. A flicker, a fracture, a moment where the man who curated every expression failed to catch one before it escaped. Adrian's smile faltered. Not fully, just enough. Enough for the nearest board member to straighten in his chair. Enough for the investors at the back to stop sipping their drinks. Enough for the room to exhale in one cautious breath. He tried to recover with a soft laugh, but it came out thin, brittle. The kind of laugh that doesn't reach the eyes because the eyes are too busy calculating. "Mira," he said, angling his body toward me, lowering his voice as though this were a private conversation. "You're tired. It's been a difficult quarter." "You're misinterpreting. I'm not tired," I said gently. "I'm aware." The shift in his expression was microscopic, but devastating. A grain of truth lodged where he least wanted it. Behind us, the projections continued to loop my failures, red and damning, except now, every time the slide changed, people saw the omissions he hoped they would never question. One of the analysts murmured something under her breath. Her colleague leaned in, squinting at the numbers, the timestamps. Whispers moved through the crowd like a slow ripple carried by the tide. Adrian heard them. It tightened something in his posture, a quick, involuntary response. His mask slipped again. I stepped just close enough for only he to hear the next line. "You wanted them to see a collapse," I said quietly. "But you forgot what collapses always reveal." He swallowed. A small, stiff movement. The kind a man makes when he feels the ground shift beneath him. "Enough," he whispered. But it wasn't command anymore. It was plea dressed as authority. I lifted my chin slightly, voice steady and calm. "You showed them a story crafted for humiliation," I said. "But you didn't check the foundation beneath it." A wave hit the hull, harder this time. The chandelier above us swayed. A few people reached for the nearest table to steady themselves. And I watched it happen, the third crack. The moment the audience no longer saw him as infallible. They saw a man trying too hard, defending too quickly, explaining too much. They saw the gap between confidence and truth. Adrian's breathing hitched one sharp inhale, quickly hidden but not quickly enough. For the first time tonight, uncertainty had a pulse, and it was beating in him. The next voice that rose from the crowd wasn't mine, and it was the one question he never anticipated, the one that made his mask slip beyond repair. It came from the board table, a place Adrian had always assumed was safely, irrevocably his. "Adrian," a steady voice called out, slicing through the murmurs. "Why were those numbers omitted?" It was Mr. Hallberg's senior partner, buried in a gray suit and decades of carefully guarded neutrality. A man who rarely spoke unless the ground beneath him truly shifted. His question dropped into the room like a stone into deep water. The silence that followed was the ripple. Adrian blinked too slowly. His fingers twitched. He stood just a little too still. "That's not," he began, voice thin. "Because Mira's right," Hallberg continued, folding his hands together. "The data set is incomplete." I snapped toward the screens, then toward Adrian, then toward me. Adrian laughed or tried to. The sound cracked on impact. "We can discuss this offline," he said quickly. "This isn't the appropriate setting. You made it the setting," someone whispered sharply. He heard it, and so did everyone else. The drowned ship groaned beneath us again, as though listening with ancient disapproval. A low vibration trembled through the deck, through the soles of our shoes, through the heat of the lights. I watched Adrian's throat tighten, a sign of panic he once told me he never felt. "Mira is misinterpreting the projections," he said sharply. "She's emotional." "She's Adrian," I said softly, stopping him cold. "Don't reduce me just because you're losing control." A few people inhaled sharply, not because the line was sharp, but because it was true. He turned toward me slowly, like a man preparing to steady a crumbling facade. His voice dropped to a low, clipped whisper meant to sound calm. "You don't know what you're inviting, neither do you," I replied. Something flickered in his eyes, a quick, startled recognition. Not of me, but of himself, as if he'd seen, for the first time, the reflection of the man he'd become. Before he could gather himself, Hallberg spoke again. "I'd like to know," he said, louder this time, "why the partnership numbers weren't included." A wave of agreement murmured through the room. Glasses clinked. Chairs shifted. The audience had turned from spectators to witnesses. Adrian opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He stood there, framed by the drowning ship, the failing graphs, the rising suspicion. A leader suddenly lacking a story. The quiet stretched too long, far too long, and in that dangerous, fragile silence, everyone realized the same truth. For the first time, Adrian didn't have an answer. What happened next wasn't planned, not by him, and not by anyone watching, but it was the moment that exposed the first real fault line beneath the entire company. When the silence grew too heavy for the room to pretend it was anything else, the ship responded first. A long, shuddering groan rolled through the hull, deeper this time, almost resonant. The lanterns overhead swayed. The water outside pressed closer to the glass, rippling with dark, shifting light. It felt as though the ship remembered something the rest of us had forgotten. Structures collapse from the inside long before anyone notices the cracks. Adrian exhaled sharply, pulling himself upright, reshaping his face into the mask he trusted more than truth. "The partnership numbers aren't relevant," he said, with forced composure. "We haven't secured that deal yet." Hallberg frowned. "We signed the preliminary agreement last week." A pulse of shock moved through the crowd. It hit Adrian harder than anyone. Because he hadn't expected Hallberg to know that. Because he hadn't expected anyone to. He cleared his throat, slipping into a brittle laugh. "A formality. Nothing is guaranteed at this stage, including Mira's projections." I stepped forward, my voice quiet, not confrontational, just certain. "The projections weren't mine, Adrian. They came from your office." He froze in place. A single beat. A flash of recognition, the wrong kind. The kind a man feels when he realizes there's only one direction left to fall. A woman near the front, one of the senior analysts with an impeccable memory, frowned. "I sent those files to you 2 days ago," she said. "The full set, including the partnership data," and there it was. The moment the room inhaled as one. The moment suspicion crystallized into something far more dangerous. Adrian turned toward her too quickly, too sharply. His voice dipped into something thin and defensive. "Well, perhaps there was a versioning issue." "There wasn't," she replied gently. Not accusing, just honest. I triple-checked the upload. The eyes in the room shifted again away from her, away from me and settled on him with steady, mounting clarity. Adrian's hand tightened around the microphone until his knuckles went pale. A storm of calculations rushed behind his eyes, none of them landing cleanly. "Mira," he said suddenly, addressing me like a man grasping for a familiar weapon, "why are you doing this?" It wasn't anger. It wasn't authority. It was fear masquerading as confusion. He expected me to falter at the question. I didn't. "You brought us here to tell a story," I said softly. "I'm simply finishing it." The room held its breath, and for the first time, Adrian looked around and realized he wasn't at the center anymore. He wasn't the voice everyone trusted. He was the question they needed answered. The drowned ship groaned once more, louder this time, a warning or a reckoning. And then someone in the back spoke the sentence that would break the night open. "Adrian, what else did you change?" The moment that followed wouldn't just shake Adrian, it would unravel the entire illusion he'd built around himself. And none of them were prepared for what surfaced next. The question drifted through the room like a cold current. "Adrian, what else did you change?" It didn't arrive loudly, but its weight was unmistakable. People shifted, leaning forward in their seats as though the answer might breach the surface at any second. Adrian stiffened. His jaw tensed so sharply I could almost hear the grind of his teeth. "I didn't change anything," he said, too quickly, too defensively. The room noticed the speed. They always do. A ripple of quiet murmurs undulated across the deck. Even the sea outside seemed to darken, pressing its heavy shadows against the ship's windows. I watched him breathe short, clipped breaths through his nose. The breathing of a man trying to keep water from rising in his lungs. He turned toward the crowd, forcing a smile. "Everyone, let's not jump to conclusions. Miscommunications happen. Data gets mixed." Mira's had a stressful quarter, and I stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the steadiness in my voice, the kind he'd underestimated for too long. "Adrian," I said, "look at them." He didn't want to, but he did. Every face in that room reflected the same truth. Trust was slipping, inch by careful inch, like sand dragged back into the tide. One of the younger managers raised her hand. Her voice trembled, but her resolve didn't. "You said the restructuring numbers were finalized last month," she said quietly. "But the documents we saw were missing signatures." Adrian's eyes flicked to her quick, irritated, cornered. "That's because I had to revise some sections before." "Before what?" Halberg asked. His tone wasn't hostile. It was worse. It was curious. Curiosity from a man like him could break kingdoms. Adrian swallowed. The microphone trembled in his hand. "I was aligning them with updated projections." "Which projections?" another board member asked. "Because none of us received updated versions." A murmur rose, sharper now, threading through the crowd with growing momentum. Adrian's breath hitched. He dragged his free hand through his hair, a gesture he hadn't made in public in years. The movement broke the last illusion of composure. "Mira," he said, voice cracking at the edges, "you're making this look worse than it is." I held his gaze quiet, steady, unflinching. "I'm not making it look like anything," I replied softly. "You're standing in the light you chose." His throat tightened. The audience felt the shift. Everyone did. The drowned ship moaned again, a deep, resonant sound that rolled across the deck like the groan of something long buried, rising. Behind us, the projection screens flickered. For a moment, they showed only static. Then the numbers returned sharp, unforgiving, whole. And someone whispered the words that changed everything. "The incomplete set wasn't an accident." Adrian's face strained of color. Because now, the room wasn't asking for explanations. They were hunting for truth. And the next revelation waiting below the surface would drag everything and everyone much deeper than they expected. The word accident lingered in the air like smoke. No one claimed it. No one repeated it. They didn't need to. The room already understood. Adrian's gaze darted from face to face, searching for someone, anyone to anchor him. But the crowd that once applauded his confidence now studied him with something far colder: recognition. Recognition of patterns they'd ignored. Recognition of red flags they'd excused. Recognition that this moment wasn't spontaneous, it was overdue. I watched his throat move in a hard swallow. He was running out of breath, out of lines, out of exits. Everyone needs to calm down, Adrian said, voice strained. This is getting blown out of proportion, but nothing was blown. Nothing was exaggerated. Nothing was loud. The danger here was silence, clean, clinical silence, as the room collectively realized they were piecing something together. Hallberg leaned back in his chair, studying Adrian with the detached patience of a man who had buried better leaders. Show us the full document set, he said. Adrian froze. It was subtle, a pause hardly longer than a blink. But in that blink, the truth surfaced. He didn't have them. Or worse, he had them, but they didn't match his story. I don't have access to them right now, he said carefully. A lie, a weak, obvious lie. The analysts in the front row exchanged glances. They knew his login level. They knew what he could access with a tap of his finger. A soft voice rose from the side of the room. Why didn't you share the revised forecasts with us? Another followed. Why did your numbers contradict the market brief? And another. Why did you tell us Mira approved the restructuring model? My breath caught quietly in my chest. That detail slipped out. I stayed composed, but inside, something cold and familiar shifted. Adrian didn't look at me, but the truth was already carving itself into the space between us. He had used my name, my credibility, as insulation. And now, under scrutiny, the insulation burned away. You said Mira signed off on the model personally, someone repeated, louder. All eyes turned to me. I stepped into the light fully. Not to defend myself, simply to stand in the truth. I never approved it, I said gently. Not any version. A ripple tore through the crowd, sharper than any wave hitting the hull. Adrian's face strained. His breath caught. His hand trembled around the microphone. He whispered, Mira, don't. Why not? I asked, voice soft as tide foam. You already put my name on documents I never saw. He inhaled through his teeth-shattered composure disguised as anger. That's enough, he said, but no one obeyed him. Because they finally understood. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't an oversight. This wasn't about numbers. This was about manipulation, control, fabrication. A senior accountant rose slowly from her seat. I want to know, she said, her voice steady and devastating, what else he signed in your name. A hush fell, terrifying in its precision. Adrian's mask didn't just crack this time. It shattered. And in that ruins of silence, the night prepared to reveal the piece of evidence that would end all doubt, the one thing Adrian could never explain away. The accountant's question hung in the air like a dropped anchor, heavy enough to pull the entire room down with it. What else did he sign in your name? Adrian didn't speak. He couldn't. His silence was no longer strategy, it was exposure. People shifted, chairs creaked, glasses were quietly set down. The drowned ship groaned beneath us, a long, resonant sound as though even its rusted bones understood the gravity of what hovered in the air. Then a voice rose from the back, unsure at first, but steadying with each word. I can check, said Lyon, one of the junior auditors. Her tablet screen glowed against her face like a lantern in deep water. If her signature was used on internal approvals, it'll show in the revision logs, Adrian snapped to life. No, that's confidential data, he said sharply. You don't have clearance. Hallberg turned to her slowly. Run it, a simple order, quiet, absolute. Adrian stepped forward, panic leaking through the cracks of his composure. This is inappropriate. You can't blindly search documents mid-event. It's a violation of protocol. So was falsifying signatures, someone muttered. Adrian whipped toward them, breath unsteady. His face had gone pale beneath the warm lights. A fine sheen of sweat gathered at his hairline. Meanwhile, Lyon's fingers moved across the tablet with calm precision. Tap, swipe, open, verify. The room held its breath. She frowned. Then her brows lifted, not in confusion, but in something colder. Confirmation. Mira, she said, voice trembling slightly. Your digital signature appears on 17 documents from the last 2 quarters, 17. A collective inhale cut through the room. I felt the cold coil of violation, the echo of betrayal turning from suspicion into something solid enough to stand on. But I kept my breathing even. Adrian's eyes locked onto mine, wild and pleading, as if a single look from me could rewrite the truth emerging around him. I did it for the company, he said, voice cracking. You weren't responding. Deadlines, you forged my approval, I said softly. No, he whispered. Then louder, desperate. No, I aligned your decisions with reality. A stunned silence followed, the kind that arrives when someone says something so revealing, so catastrophically honest, that the world pauses to understand it. Halberg's voice broke the stillness. Show the documents. Lion tapped the screen. The projector flickered. And suddenly, the forbidden files glowed behind us, page after page, each stamped with my forged signature, each one a betrayal, each one a lie dressed in my name. Adrian lunged forward. Turn that off. His voice cracked over itself, raw and panicked. But the room didn't hear panic. They heard guilt. Every face turned toward him, not with curiosity anymore, but with quiet, dawning judgment. His downfall had begun. He knew it. I saw it in the tremor of his hand, the tightening of his throat, the way his gaze flicked toward the exit like a man considering escape. But there was nowhere left for him to go. Not on this ship. Not on this night. Because truth, once surfaced, is impossible to drown again. And there was still something he didn't realize. One of those documents contained the mistake that would destroy everything he built, and the room was seconds away from finding it. Lion's fingers hovered over the tablet, her eyes narrowing with each passing second. The room was so quiet we could hear the old ship breathe, metal straining beneath the weight of water and truth. There's something else, she murmured. A ripple of unease moved through the guests. Adrian stiffened. Stop, that's enough. Close the file. But Lion didn't. She couldn't. Her expression shifted, confusion, then disbelief, then a sharp, focused alertness that changed the air around us. Which one is it? Halberg asked. She hesitated, swallowing hard. Document 47B. The restructuring order. I felt the room tilt. Not physically, emotionally. The kind of tilt that happens right before gravity changes. Adrian's face went white. No, he whispered. Not that one. The panic in his voice was too raw, too revealing. People noticed. Everyone noticed. Lion tapped the file. The projector flared to life, illuminating the document behind us. Dense text, lines of authorization, a row of digital signatures. And there, stamped beside mine, elegantly forged, perfectly falsified, was Adrian's own signature, dated 6 weeks before the board approval. A stunned silence swept through the room. Everyone knew what that meant. No explanation needed. He had executed the restructuring before it was approved. He had committed fraud. He had gambled with the company's financials. And he had tried to bury it under my stolen name. Adrian's breathing turned ragged. He stepped backward, shaking his head like a man drowning in air. This is out of context, he whispered. I was safeguarding the timeline. The board would have dragged their feet. Mira understood the urgency. I never saw this document, I said. Quiet. Steady. He flinched as if struck. Mira, please, but this time, the room wasn't watching me. They were watching him unravel. A board member stood. You executed a corporate action without authorization. Another rose beside him, and falsified the CFO's signature to do it. Adrian's voice broke. Everyone does this. This is how leadership works. Sometimes decisions must be made without waiting for illegally. Halberg asked, his tone pure ice. Adrian's mouth snapped shut. Lion scrolled further down the document, her expression tightening. Oh, she whispered. Oh my God. The projector highlighted a section in red. A clause, a single line he had added. A line that shifted operational risk onto me, solely me, if the restructuring failed. My name was the insurance policy, my reputation the shield, and he had intended for me to take the fall. A collective gasp rippled through the room, anger, shock, disbelief blending into something sharper. Adrian staggered forward. That wasn't I didn't mean Mira, you know I wouldn't. His desperation filled the space like smoke. But I simply looked at him, calm, steady, the eye of the storm he'd created. You weren't planning to take responsibility, I said softly. You were planning to disappear behind my name. His knees nearly buckled. The ship groaned once more, a long, ancient sound, as if echoing the moment a kingdom cracks. And still there was more. Because document 47B wasn't just proof of fraud, it contained something else. Something he thought he'd buried forever. Something the room hadn't yet seen. And when they did, Adrian's collapse wouldn't just be professional, it would be personal, irreversible, and witnessed by every soul on this sinking ship. The lights hummed above us, flickering just once as if the ship itself braced for what came next. Lion's voice emerged as barely a whisper. There's an attachment. Every pair of eyes lifted toward the screen. Adrian's reaction was instant, violent. He lunged forward, reaching for her tablet with a strangled, "Don't open that." Halberg intercepted him with a single outstretched arm, not forceful, just firm enough to stop a man who had finally lost the one thing he worshipped, control. "Let her continue," Halberg said. Adrian froze in place, breathing hard, sweat gathering at his temples. His polished exterior, the one crafted from charm and ambition, had collapsed into something frantic and unguarded. Lion tapped the icon. A second document unfolded across the projector screen. A letter, simple, unassuming, more dangerous than anything he'd tried to hide tonight. I felt a coldness rise inside me, not shock, not hurt, but recognition. Because I knew that file. Or rather, I knew the situation it referenced. I just never knew he had been behind it. The header read, "Recommendation for termination CFOM, R. Hale filed 3 months ago." Signed by Adrian. The room gasped, sharp, collective, human. He had prepared my removal. Before the restructuring. Before the forged signatures. Before the numbers he twisted into a weapon. Before tonight's humiliation. My downfall had been scripted long before I ever stepped onto this drowned ship. Adrian stumbled backward, eyes wide, throat working through broken breaths. That wasn't supposed, he choked on the words. I didn't submit it. It was a draft. Only a draft, then why is it dated and signed? Someone asked coldly. It's procedural, Adrian pleaded. I was considering options, that's all. Options? I echoed softly. My voice wasn't loud, yet it carried through the room like a clean, cold blade. Every head turned toward me. Adrian looked at me the way a man looks at a truth he can no longer outrun. You wanted me gone, I said. You tried to erase me before any of this began. No, he whispered, stepping towards me. Mira, please, this isn't what it looks like. I panicked. The numbers scared me. The board was restless. I thought if I of you, he stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Because the sentence held the truth. He tried to sacrifice me, quietly, efficiently, elegantly, all under the guise of leadership. The crowd's whispers grew sharper, cutting through the stale air like shards of glass. You forged her signature, you hid financial risk under her name, you planned her termination before the quarter even closed, you tried to blame her for your fraud. Each voice was a stone sinking him deeper. Adrian's composure shattered completely. His hand shook as he reached toward me, not to attack, but to beg. Mira, you have to believe me. I wasn't going to go through with it. I met his eyes. Calm, steady, unafraid. I don't need to believe you, I said. They already don't, he broke. His breath caught. His shoulders sagged. His eyes darted. For a moment, no one moved. The ship didn't groan. The lights didn't flicker. Even the sea beyond the glass seemed to pause, as if the world itself waited for whatever came next. Lion's voice trembled as she spoke again. This last file. It isn't financial. Those words alone chilled the air. Adrian's breath left him in a shuddered exhale. He stumbled backward until his shoulder hit the railing, fingers clutching metal as if the ship were the only thing keeping him upright. Don't, he whispered, barely audible. Please, don't open it. No one listened. Lion tapped the document. The projector bloomed to life, a report. Private, confidential, addressed to the board's legal division. Subject concerns regarding Adrian K. Hale potential misconduct. Filed by M.R. Hale timestamp 11 months ago. Stunned silence rippled through the room, confusion first, disbelief second, comprehension last. He stared at the screen like it was a ghost wearing his guilt, but I didn't. Lion murmured, brow furrowed. Mira didn't file this, no, I said quietly. I didn't. The room's attention snapped to Adrian. His face had drained of all color because they understood before he could speak the truth he feared. He filed the report himself, under my name, to preemptively protect himself if his schemes collapsed. He had created a false whistleblower me months before trying to execute my removal, a weapon forged in advance, a shield crafted from my identity, and now exposed in front of everyone. Halberg rose from his chair, slow and deliberate. Adrian, he said, you used her name to fabricate a legal trail. Against the company and against her. Adrian's knees buckled. He grabbed the railing hard, knuckles widening. No, he rasped. I didn't mean that file wasn't supposed to be. He stopped, words slipping through trembling fingers. He wasn't defending himself anymore. He was unraveling. Mira. He looked at me, not with arrogance or confidence or superiority, but with the empty, fragile desperation of a man who had reached the end of every road he paved. I wasn't trying to hurt you, he whispered. I just needed someone to trust me. I held his gaze, calm and steady. You could have told the truth, I said softly. It would have trusted you more than anything else. His breath hitched. The board moved as one quiet, efficient, final. Phones came out. Calls were placed. Our legal compliance.no raised voices. No harsh words. Just quiet consequences rolling across the deck like an incoming tide. Adrian didn't fight. He couldn't. He stood there, hollowed out, staring at the ruins of the empire he'd built on borrowed trust and stolen names. As security approached, he whispered one last plea, not angry, not manipulative, just terrified. Mira, please, say something. So I did. I stepped forward until he could hear me without the microphone. Until only he could hear the truth he'd finally earned. You drowned yourself long before this ship, I said gently. And you know it. His shoulders collapsed. Security guided him away. No applause. No cheers. Just silence, heavy, honest, final. The projector dimmed. The numbers faded. The ship groaned beneath us one last time, as though acknowledging the justice delivered in its hull. I looked out toward the black water through the glass. The surface calm now, unbroken, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the same. Sometimes silence is the loudest revenge of all.